we're going to talk about the results of an experiment I did to try to achieve late summer, early fall stock here in New Jersey in Zone 7A. So for those of you who are new to my channel, my name's Jessie. I am in my third year of flower farming, and stock is one of my favorite flowers. I love it for its scent. I love it for the way the flowers look. And I just think that imported stock just cannot compare to locally grown stock. And so stock is one of those tricky crops because it is a Mediterranean type of crop which prefers very temperate types of weather and temperatures. And what ends up happening is that most people try to grow stock in the spring, but with our springs getting a lot shorter, meaning that the time of your last frost to temperatures going really, really high is a much shorter period, I think, today than it was like 10 years ago. So a lot of us struggle to grow good spring stock, especially if we're ordering plugs, because these plugs are not hardened off enough to survive some of the lower temperatures at night in the mid-late spring timeframe. So all this to say, I haven't had much success with growing spring stock. I've gotten a few stems here and there, but I've been determined to get a real crop of stock, and that's how I decided to experiment getting late summer, early fall stock. So you can see over here, I did it. And I did it with 2 trays. So this is really, really exciting. And I wanted to share just what I did. So that way, those of you who are in the same boat as me might be able to glean some learnings and do this for yourself. We're going to cover a few topics in this video, including the impact of photo period on stock and flowering, talk about some varieties, singles versus doubles, and then talk about a few things that I did, which I think really helped me get to this successful state right now. So first, let's talk about photo period, which is simply defined as how much daytime light do you have versus nighttime. And this is really important because different flowers have different preferences, and it will initiate flowering depending on how much light you have. So in this case, stock tends to be what we call a short day type of crop. It prefers these shorter days to grow, cooler nights to grow, and then it initiates flowers typically not at the height of summer when there are very long days, but towards the shorter day type of period. Now you're going to see a lot of variability. I've seen people grow stock in like late June. Obviously my stock started flowering back in like late August, early September. So there's nuances to this, but for the most part, stock is a short day type of flower. And I will say that there are many people who have success growing stock both in the spring and in the fall. Just typically doesn't happen in a climate like mine in the fall. And the reason is because our summers get really, really hot here in New Jersey. And even in the last, I would say like month of August, we were still consistently in the 90s. What changes is that at night, the temperatures do start dropping a little bit. But in order to get stock at this stage over here to bloom in September, you really need to start putting the stock into the ground in July when it is at its hottest and the heat is really just not something that's suited for stock. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why I think I had success despite those circumstances. So now that we've established that stock is a short day type of flower, we need to talk more about variety selection here, because variety selection is really, really important. Similar to like a snapdragon, there's different types of stock. Now, they don't necessarily have groups for stock like they do for snapdragons. You have 4 groups of snapdragons, and the groups are a great indicator for just when they're going to flower. So some snapdragons are going to flower a little bit earlier. They prefer these shorter days, like things like Chantilly or Maryland. Those are shorter day types of varieties in groups 1, 2, Legend Pink, those ones. But you also have certain types of snapdragons like Rocket and Potomac that prefer the longer days, and those are typically like group 3, group 4. You also have that with Lisianthus. So although we don't have designated groups for stock, we do know that certain varieties are going to come about earlier. So for example, Cats is usually one of the first stock to bloom in the spring, followed by like an Iron, followed by a Column, right? So you want to make sure that you're looking at the right variety. And what I did differently for the fall versus in the spring was in the spring, I selected things like Column, Cats, and iron, which are not necessarily very heat tolerant. This variety over here is called Quartet. And what makes Quartet different from other stock are two things. One is that it's not a one and done type of crop. It actually has side branches. So these side shoots will also create flowers, and you do have to pinch when you see flowers coming to get sufficient length in those side stems. But the more important factor about Quartet stock is that it tends to be a little bit more heat resistant. Now, in the culture sheets by Cicada, who breeds Quartet stock, it basically says that it prefers daytime temperatures of 70 degrees and nighttime temperatures, like I think it was like 45 to like 60 degrees or something like that. I'll put the culture sheet up here so you guys can see. But what I've learned in my short time of flower farming is that plants typically have a higher tolerance of weather extremes that they do not like in their seedling phase. I know this to be true for things like ranunculus, and now I know this to also be true for things like stock. So even though this was planted a little bit after the July 4th weekend, where we're having temperatures in the high 90s at night, we're still in the 80s. It's like it's height of summer. This stock as a seedling was able to weather those temperatures, and I will say that they remained a little bit stunted for a while, and they eventually did put up growth. So I was concerned at first because they didn't seem to be doing too much. They were kind of just, I felt like in some ways they were almost struggling to just get established because of the heat, but they were able to do it. So you want to make sure that if you're doing something like this and you live in a climate similar to mine, where you're getting them in when it's really, really hot, that you choose a variety like Quartet. Now, I mentioned before that Quartet is cut and come again. It's technically not cut and come again. It's like you pinch it and then there's a few branching side shoots. I've found that those side shoots don't generate stem length that is worthy enough for me to put or to sell wholesale, or to really make in like taller mixed bouquets. So what I do is I treat these as one and done. Many of these are actually flowering like a single type of stock variety. So you can see this is like one straight stem, but there are certain ones, like if I show you this one over here, that you can see there is some branching habit over here where they're putting up shoots. Now, if I had pinched this a little bit earlier, you would see more shoots coming out. And I'll show you a picture up here of one stock that I pinched and an example of what those side shoots look like. But for the most part, I've been able to treat these as one and done. And I have found that the stock that is flowering a little bit later in the Quartet series are definitely having longer stems because it's obviously cooler nights. I would say that the most amount of rapid growth that I experienced in these stock came when the nighttime temperatures finally started cooling down into the 60s. And I'm talking about like high 60s. Like you started definitely seeing this stock hit its stride. So let me show you length right now, because this is probably some of the taller stock that I've grown. The first stock that flowered, which I'll show you a little bit later, came in on a little bit on the shorter side. And I would say shorter side would be around here, which is like 14, 15 inches. Now we're actually getting stock that is closer to like this one would be 20 inches over here. And then like you can see over here, this one is a particularly good one. This one is 19 inches over here. The stock that I just showed you before was an apricot color, and I found that interestingly, even though it's the same exact cultivar as the one over here, this rose color one flowered a lot earlier. Now, that being said, I did get the rose color one into the ground, I would say probably about 2 weeks earlier, but the apricot stock didn't start flowering until probably about 3 weeks afterwards. So I think there might also be a difference with color. But if you look over here, a lot of these I've actually already picked. I've sold probably about 90 stems from this bunch over here, and there's still some left. But you can see the earlier stock over here was probably around this height, 16 inches. And now we're getting much higher stems as the weather cools over here. So if I can just increase my ruler over here. So you can see over here, we're at 24 inches on this stem over here. Now, some of these are just too late. I just haven't had a chance to pick them and use them, but you know, I've gotten enough out of here where I'm pretty happy with this. Let's actually take some time to talk about singles versus doubles. So the Quartet series, Cicada says that there's a 55% rate of doubles, which means that there's a 45% rate of singles. My personal experience was that the doubles primarily all flowered first, and then now I'm kind of stuck with the singles, which I'm not using. So singles are like, they don't have as much longevity. You can see that they're kind of like, the flowers have all fallen. They're already even starting to set seed. But I would say that the 45-55% is pretty accurate. Like, I am seeing about close to half of these being single. And unfortunately, single is just like not great, even for mixed bouquets, because the flower life just isn't as great as the doubles. But I think that it's still perfectly fine to buy from plugs, not being able to select for doubles ahead of time like you would with seed. If you're starting stock from seed, there's like a little process you can go through during the collodon stage. You put them into like a little bit cooler temperature. You look at the color of it, and basically you can predict with a high level of certainty what's going to be a double versus single. And Johnny has a great resource on that, so I'll link that below in case if you're interested. But when you buy from plugs, typically one plug has multiple seeds in there. So even though this is like a tray of 116, you're not getting 116, you're almost getting like 200 something flowers. So that also helps increase the amount of doubles. And that's why I've been able to sell basically like close to 100 stems in a 116 tray, and you seeing like all of these flowers over here still not picked. When I planted the stock, I did a couple of patches for experimenting to experiment with stem length and even see if there was a difference on quality. So you can see over here that this full row was just stock, right? This is kind of like a traditional monocrop row. From a spacing perspective, I crammed them in pretty tightly. I would say it was like maybe 4.5, 6 inches at best in between the flowers. I mean, like, look, I don't have a ton of space here, and I found that the intensive cropping also helps with weed pressure. But I want to show you this patch over here where I actually intercropped with some curcuma. So curcuma is a new crop that some of us are experimenting with this year. It's basically like an Asian tulip. It's like it's part of the turmeric family. So this is oriental turmeric. It loves the heat and the humidity, and it's actually struggling a bit with our lower nighttime temps. But I'm talking about this because I interplanted the stock with this curcuma, and I did find that the canopy of this curcuma definitely helped with the stock that flowered earlier, and the stock that did flower earlier here actually grew a little bit taller. And at this point right now, I would say that most of the height for the flowering stock has been, or the shorter stock has caught up in some ways to the stock in this row. So now less of an impact, but the intercropping definitely helped in the beginning when I got blooms in August. This here is actually a good example of what happens when you don't pinch stock and it starts having these side shoots. And this is not a bad thing, because if I were to cut this and put this into a bouquet, it really helps fill up a bouquet. And I've learned that stock can be quite a great filler for that reason. And one spray of a single stem like this just gives such a great scent. So I think that my mixed bouquets have been doing really, really well because of this over here. And it's just kind of funny because now I'm looking at, this is what the seed pods look like for stock. Might try to save these, might just let them self-seed and see what happens. But this is what the remaining stock patch looks like over here. Now let's talk about what I did to keep these alive so that they could bloom right now when it's prime time. I would say that the single most important factor was selecting the right variety, Quartet. But when I planted these, I made sure that I had shade cloth on top of these seedlings, especially when it was going to be really, really hot. Now, I wasn't super consistent with this just because there were days where, I had to go to work. I couldn't keep up with it. There were days when we went to the hospital and it was just like too hard to do that. But for the most part, I would say that probably 70% of the time they were kept under shade cloth. And It's kind of hard to tell over here, but there is no irrigation in this field, believe it or not. So that is a bit of a risky play. This year, I would say that in the months of July and August, we got adequate rainfall. It wasn't like the best, but it also wasn't a drought. Funnily enough, this past month, we've had a bit of a drought type of weather period, but you know, like at the end of the day, I have very clayish soil. It helps retain moisture. There is a lot of regenerative type of agriculture practices that we employ over here. So the soil is definitely able to retain a higher bit of moisture, but something for you to consider if you're growing this. And I say this because when I first put the stock into the ground, the seedlings, I made sure that I watered them in really, really well. And I also made sure that I watered them consistently, at least for like 1 week after. So realistically, you should be watering them for probably like 2-3 weeks, making sure they're established. And maybe that's why they were kind of like limping along for a bit. But you can see it still was fine. And I didn't do a lot of fertilizer. I only fertilized them twice. So upon watering them in, I fertilized them with a fish fertilizer that I use for everything. I use Neptune's Harvest, and then I fertilized them again 2 weeks after, and that was it. I didn't fertilize again. It's just without like irrigation and having a hose out here that really reaches out, it's hard to realistically fertilize everything to the extent that I would like to. I mean, I guess I could wear a backpack and do foliar spray, but honestly, like I just didn't have time this season to do that. And I say this again because look, I was able to achieve pretty decent stock without crazy fertilization. I think if I were to do things over, I might actually order the stock to arrive a little bit later in July, because I do think that it would still flower around the same time, maybe delay it by like a week or two. But I don't think that the heat necessarily accelerated their growth. I think if anything, it might have slowed them down. So I do think that in the future, I could probably push getting the plugs in sometime in like later July and then put them into the ground, and then I'd probably have a little bit less babying to do. But the implications of having stock at this time are, one, I think I'm probably the only person around a close radius here, like 50 miles to 100 miles, who has local stock for our florists. Our florists love them. Whenever I bring bunches to the market floor, they get gobbled up pretty quickly. And it's not like I have a ton to bring to market floor. I typically have like, you know, an extra like 3-4 bunches to bring because they do pretty well in pre-orders. I think that stock is one of those flowers that a lot of florists like to work with. And a lot of florists actually haven't worked with local stock and haven't just smelled how good it is and how fluffy the flowers can be. I think imported stock, unfortunately, the flowers sometimes just get ruined from the weight of the shipment. So it's a bit of a shame because I think stock is a much more superior flower than sometimes what we see, especially at the grocery store, right? Like it's not uncommon to see stock in grocery store blooms. But yeah, so all that to say, I will definitely be just using the Quartet stock series going forward. At this point, I've kind of just given up on doing cats or iron. I've seen growers around me do it very beautifully in the spring. I just haven't figured out a way to do it, and I think that Quartet just gives me a bit more flexibility since it's willing to tolerate the heat. And so that way, if I put it in later spring and it hasn't flowered by like mid-late June, it still has a chance to flower in July. And I remember seeing Nicole from Flower Hill Farm a few years ago plant Quartet stock and actually have stock in early summer. So I think that that would actually be a really good alternative for people who are looking to grow stock but haven't had success doing so. So last but not least, a quick update on our life. If you haven't been following me and are new to my channel, our daughter recently got diagnosed with cancer, and I would say that at this point, it's taking a bit of a toll on me mentally where, you know, it's nice to be in here, but I'm basically just going to shut down the flower farm and do some retail bouquets, but I'm done selling wholesale. There's a bunch of flowers, gorgeous flowers that are just in bloom. It's nice to enjoy. Sometimes I see my daughter just like walking over by herself trying to open the gate because she also likes being in here too. But I've invited some local flower farmers, even florists, to come cut for free just to, you know, make sure the blooms don't go to waste. But yeah, I would say that overall, I'm still trying to figure out what the rest of my season looks like because I do specialize in winter tulips. I'm not even sure if I'm going to do that. Lastly, before I sign off, I just want to say a huge, huge thank you to everyone who has donated to the study that my daughter is currently enrolled in. This study is basically a preclinical study that they're doing before they can move into the clinical phase. And it's a really, really important study for people who have my daughter's mutation, but also for people in general who have cancers. 50% of the cancers that adults end up getting have this kind of mutation. And it's one of the most stubborn, aggressive types of mutations in the sense that it makes a tumor very, very aggressive. So I think that's what significantly changed since I've kind of done my last few videos, is just this acknowledgement that the prognosis is definitely a lot lower or worse because of the presence of having this mutation. And so the ability for researchers to really study this specific mutation not only has implications on people like my daughter, but for a general population with cancer. So the thing about this study is that without donations and funding like this, it's really hard to expedite that research into clinical trial phase. So thank you to those of you who have donated. And if you would consider and haven't donated yet, I'm going to put the link below. These past few weeks have been really difficult because I think anyone who has gone through cancer or has immediate love member who is going through cancer understands the excruciating anxiety of just waiting for more information and just not knowing what's going to happen. And part of the reason why I'm shutting down the flower field is because my daughter is actually doing pretty well with chemotherapy. Like, she's not having a ton of nausea. She's still playing like a toddler. And I just don't know how long that's going to be. She might take a turn for the worse at any time. She may not even make it. This might be our last holiday season with her. So with all that in mind, I've definitely wanted to make sure I've enjoyed the present moment with her and tried to just be as present as possible and be grateful that we at least still have this time together that's quality.
Is that rain?